In this video, I'm gonna share some tips on how you can make your photos more cinematic. Cinematic street photography has been my favorite form of photography for the past 2 or 3 years. It's something that I love seeing from other photographers that I follow and something that I've been trying to do myself as well. Now, of course, cinematic is YouTube's favorite buzzword. What I mean by cinematic is photos that seem like they could have been screen grabs from a movie, or photos that even tell a story on their own. I think sometimes a little bit too much emphasis is put on the editing part of this. So I'm gonna first talk about how you can take more cinematic photos in the field, and then I'm gonna show you how I edit them in Adobe Lightroom at the end of this video as well. I think the number one tip in order to make your photos more cinematic is add a storytelling element into your photography. This is something that is easier said than done. Especially in street photography, adding storytelling is one of the most difficult things that takes years to learn how to do consistently and really well. But even knowing that you can add a story to something like street photography is the first step when it comes to starting how to learn how to make more cinematic photos. Because if a photo has a story in it, it instantly makes it more cinematic, because how many movies have you seen that don't have any kind of plot or story at all? And I don't mean cinematic movies on YouTube, I'm talking about actual movies. Adding a storytelling element into your photography is a little bit easier if you happen to have control of the environment, meaning if you have an actor or a model. But when it comes to street photography, things get a little bit difficult. I think for beginner street photographers, other than just knowing that you can add a story to your photos, which makes a big difference because you start looking for those stories, one thing you can do is simply stop shooting people in the back and shoot them in their face a lot more often. Now, I don't mean go directly up into everybody's face, and I don't mean that you can never take a photo of someone's back. I mean simply, if you find yourself too intimidated to take photos of people directly, it is something that is really gonna help if you start doing it in terms of the storytelling and the emotion you can add into your photography. If this is something that makes you nervous, you can check out my other video on this channel up in here about how to learn how to take photos of strangers. Another way you can improve the storytelling element of your photography is to remember to always take several photos of all the little details of the scene that you're photographing, and then plan to display those photos in a collage or a series of photos instead of just one photo. In fact, even just taking several shots from the same city and then displaying them all at once in a collage is probably one of the easiest ways to add a storytelling element into your photography, because it functions sort of similarly to a scene in a movie that sets the scene and gives the viewers more information about the type of place where the movie is set. And just showing several pictures at once is obviously just a bit closer to a movie than a standalone picture. So this is a pretty good hack you can use to make your photos more cinematic by simply displaying in a more cinematic way. So in short, just be conscious of the fact that if you can add a story into your photography, that immediately makes your photos seem more cinematic and more interesting in almost any way. I'm not saying you have to do it, I'm not saying every photo has to tell a story, but that is something you should pay attention to. The second tip is going to be a lot more easy to implement. A couple years ago, I noticed that I got a bit too obsessed with Instagram, so I was shooting every photo in the 4:5 vertical aspect ratio. But if you want to take cinematic photos, it's probably better to shoot them in the horizontal aspect. Or simply cropping in this format is instantly going to make your photos seem more like movies, because which movie have you seen that has been shot in the vertical aspect ratio? Now, by the way, if you're worried about losing Instagram engagement because you're not taking photos in the 4:5 format, you can always just post those photos in a different format, meaning you can make collages or you can just add borders, and the difference in engagement is negligible. Tip number 3 is related to the depth. Having a blurry background is not the only way you can add depth into your photos, even though bokeh is very popular and when used correctly can make your photos seem more cinematic. But in general, it helps to start adding layers into your photos. Start thinking of your photos as having a foreground, a middle ground and a background. Sometimes adding something in front of the lens into the foreground, and especially if you shoot it wide open, can add a lot of depth into your photos, make them seem more three-dimensional, and that makes them seem more like they could be stills from a movie rather than just regular photos. Tip number 4 is consider the elements and the time of day. Cinematographers have a lot of control over their movie sets. You as a photographer probably don't have as much control, but what you do have control over is deciding when you go out and take your photos. So pay attention to the time of day, direction of the sun, the weather. It's not a coincidence that every time there's a sad scene in a romantic comedy, it's always raining. And it's not a coincidence that every time there's like a happy memory, it's shot with a blurry filter on some sort of a field where it's a very sunny day, and it's usually shot a little bit overexposed. So depending on the kind of mood that you want to convey in your photography, go out during the right time of day into the right setting. I mean, that's kind of an obvious tip for photography in general, but you know. And sometimes cinematic lighting is all you need to make your photos appear cinematic. So while adding storytelling and depth and the right crop can all help, sometimes all you really need is the lighting and the elements to make your photo appear cinematic. One example of simple yet powerful cinematic lighting technique is backlight, which can be used to create contrast and silhouettes. This lighting is often used by my favorite cinematographer Roger Deakins to establish mystery and a certain kind of mood in his scenes. Another cinematic element you can look for is fog or haze, which adds diffusion to lights and shapes the environment. Cinematographers use haze or fog machines quite often, even though it may not always be so obvious. And sometimes even a simple diffusion filter, like a Pro Mist filter, can create a somewhat similar effect. Alright, now you know how to take photos to seem more cinematic, so how do you edit them? Let's jump over to Adobe Lightroom to see how you can add that finishing touch and to finalize this cinematic photography look. One thing to keep in mind when trying to edit your photos to seem more cinematic is always be realistic in your edits. Now, movies tend to be color graded to be a little bit more contrasty than real life, and sometimes they have certain white balance adjustments that are not exactly what your human eye will see, but they're still within the realms of possibility that it can trick your brain into thinking that you're seeing something that is a real scene. But as soon as you go too far in the edit, your brain goes, wait a minute, this looks wrong, and then that's when you lose the cinematic type of look. So be careful not going too far with the white balance, the coloring, or the dynamic range. There's only a certain limit of dynamic range that your eyes can see. Usually better cameras are better at capturing higher dynamic range than your eyes, so sometimes editing for the higher dynamic range is actually counterintuitive and makes your photos seem less cinematic, less real. So instead of walking you through every single step, we're just going to focus on the most important phases of cinematic editing on Lightroom that you can use to achieve this cinematic look. The reason is that all of the other individual adjustments vary from picture to picture, so showing you all of those additional steps is kind of irrelevant when it comes to this tutorial. But if you do want to see some of the more comprehensive editing walkthroughs on specific pictures from start to finish, you can check some of my earlier videos on this channel. So first, we'll focus on the tone curve. An S-shaped tone curve is going to add contrast, which is something all movies usually have a lot of. And the raised black points gives our shadows and blacks a bit of fade, which emulates the way most films look, because they were traditionally shot on film. And even if they weren't, usually they're color graded to emulate this look, even if they're on digital. Then something you can find in a lot of movies is a warm and cold color contrast. Often it is blue and orange. In this particular picture it's just blue and red. Often YouTubers go for the teal and orange look. But in any case it's all the same, warm and cold. There's a couple of ways to bring this out. Often I like to use a colder white balance to bring out the blues, but this requires a picture that already has some warmer lights in it. Then you can fine-tune the color contrast through adjusting individual colors on the HSL tab. If the color contrast isn't big enough to your liking, you can use spot edits to bring it out even more. The 16:9 or even wider crop is an easy one, but you should always also plan your shots so that you know you're gonna display them in this aspect, so that you know how to compose your photos. When coloring our image, it is important to keep everything realistic so that you don't turn people into aliens, for example, which is a giveaway and we lose that cinematic illusion. Doesn't mean you can't be creative with it, but just keep it balanced. The same principle of balance would apply when editing the dynamic range of our photo. Remember that often can be good to go the opposite way of HDR. So try crushing the shadows and blowing out the highlights sometimes and see what happens when you go for a lower dynamic range approach. Then there are small optional things you can do, such as adding grain. Grain is obviously present in most movies because most movies throughout history have been shot on film, and a grain is an element of film. Vignetting helps draw our eyes to the subject and works well, especially in night photography. And finally, we can do some spot edits on the highlights to add some diffusion by brushing them and decreasing the clarity and optionally increasing the highlight slider slightly. This mimics the effect of a pro mist filter, which is often used by many filmmakers. I mean, of course, you could always just buy a pro mist filter as well. Alright, thank you for watching the video. I hope you learned some tips on how to make your photos seem more cinematic. If you're new to the channel, check out my other videos and subscribe if you like them. I post tutorials, how-to guides and some behind-the-scenes looks at street photography and film photography. And leave me a comment if you thought this video was helpful, because that really helps with the YouTube algorithm, and that's one way you can really help me out with very little effort. So thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.